afternoon and welcome to CEC Gurukul lecture. In today's series on sociology of kinship, we're going to discuss a text which has become classical in terms of understanding gender relations and kinship. Before we go to the lecture, we know that almost all of us in urban space or be in a rural area, the number of women working has certainly increased. And a lot of credit is given to the women's movement for initiating the movement towards the participation of women in paid labor. But did this paid labor bring about any change in the nature of the work that women did in the domestic sphere? So with reference to this trivial issue of a domestic work being unrecognized, invisible, an important work has been done to understand that domestic relations, marriage are not private per se, but are connected to the political sphere. And therefore, we're going to understand how the negotiation of the personal and the private kind of political interacts to help us understand gender relations. We are going to refer to C. Wright Mill's work, where he tries to say that the most fruitful distinction with which the sociological imagination works is between the personal troubles of milieu and the public issues of social structure. So with the interaction of the two emerges the social imagination. Arlie Hochschild, following C.W. Mill's sociological imagination, shows how working parents struggle over an ostensibly personal domestic problem, which is termed as the second shift of housework and child care, are also struggles over interpersonal management of wider social, economic and cultural pressures bearing on gender and family role. So the private and the public is no longer pole opposed, or they are kind of not completely aloof of each other. What is happening in the public is influencing the private, and when we are here referring to the private or the domestic sphere, the reference is to marriage, the reference is to the gender relation between conjugal couple. So if there is an increase in the divorce rate among women or among the men and women, it is not necessarily that it is a result of their individual problems or behavior. It is also related to the wider economic, social, structural change taking place. And therefore, when we try to understand the linkage between the private and the public, we are going to here understand an important concept called the second shift. Now, second shift is a term which is taken from the production sphere, where you have one shift of workers working in the factory from 9 to say 5, and then after 5, the second shift starts where workers would be working in the second shift. Hochschild takes this change of shift to the domestic sphere, where she will try to explain that women, after doing the first shift in the public sphere, returns back to their house for doing the second shift. And in terms of connecting the private to the public, she is trying to reveal the problem of the second shift. That why is it that men were not ready to bring about any change in their cultural understanding of work, and why is it women who are ready to do kind of double work, the public which is paid and the domestic which remains unpaid. Hochschild begins with a straightforward question. In two-job marriages with young children present, how do couples manage to juggle job demands, family care and household tasks? The fieldwork was done from 1978 to 1988 in America, and from this fieldwork she gathered a lot of data, qualitative data, a wealth of information on the rhythm of work and family life among the two job marriages. The two job marriages is referring to the household where both husband and wife are doing paid public work. The term second shift is basically taken from the book by Arlie Russell Hochschild with Anne Machung, which was published for 1989. The author is a renowned sociologist and a professor at the University of California, Berkeley. And this work, Second Shifts, comes from her own personal experience of juggling between the university and the home, taking care of the child and the domestic sphere. Hochschild investigates and portrays the double burden experienced by late 20th century employed mothers. Now, why late century? Because prior to that, the gender sociological definition, the division of labor was gendered. Men were doing public and women were doing domestic. After the Industrial Revolution, the kind of modernization and the women's movement, a number of women started taking paid job. And that kind of changed the composition of the family, the relationship between husband and wife, and also in terms of the conflict, in terms of who takes care of the child, who takes care of the aged. In the book, The Second Shift, the author discusses how women often have to juggle both their professional career and the majority of household chores and child care. It explores the inequality in domestic labor between men and women and its impacts on women's lives. The main argument of the book is that despite women's increasing participation in the workforce, they still bear the majority of household responsibilities. The book is based on evidences collected through extensive research and interviews with working couples and presents compelling case studies to illustrate the unequal distribution of domestic labor. So where there was a kind of an effort to achieve equality in the public sphere, where women were less, the push was to ensure that larger number of women participate in the public sphere. However, the other way was not in the picture. So the women started participating in the public sphere, in the paid employment, but there was no kind of effort or no kind of movement by men to start entering the domestic sphere. So therefore, what actually resulted after a decade or two of the women's increased participation was double burden. The burden of the productive work as well as the domestic work. Now, if we look into the research, and which is kind of extensive field work done over a long period of time, the author interviewed 50 couples in an attempt to extrapolate from their answers an idea of how American couples were adjusting to life in the wake of women's rights movement. So the change was taking place not only on a larger academia and activist movement, but the consequences of the movement was being observed at the micro level, that is the women's and men relation in the family. Hochschild analyzes information gleaned from these interviews and she exposes the rift between ideology and practice. The ideology was that women should participate in productive labor. Even men were in the forefront to advocate women's right to participate. However, in practice, not much support was given to ensure that she is able to participate in the productive work without the stress of the domestic. On the basis of previous time budget study, Hochschild estimated that mothers, these are working married women with children, employed outside the home, work an extra month of 24-hour days a year. So she's doing a quantitative comparison between the amount of work that men and women do in a total, and the statistics suggest that women are questionably no doubt about the doing an extra. Hochschild found that less than 20% of men she studied were equal partners when it came to house cleaning, daily chores like cooking and childcare. about 20% did some domestic work, with the remaining 60% doing little or nothing. She found that about 1/3 of the women were satisfied with their husband's limited domestic involvement. The author found that women take care of most of the household and child care responsibility despite their entrance into the labor force. And this is actually romanticized in the literature, in the lot of stories, lot of conversation between women, and it was kind of portrayed as a woman who was kind of multitasking, was capable of balancing career and child care well and balanced, and therefore it became a role model for those who were not being able to do it. So it was not that women were critical of it, women accepted it, and since it was romanticized, or since it was appreciated by the women themselves, it kind of got legitimized, and therefore the participation of women in both productive and domestic work increased the burden of work for women. Now, if we look into the problem that the author is suggesting, is that this term, the second shift, has been used by a number of scholars and academicians. What does it actually mean? It means that employed mothers face an unequal load of household labor and thus a double day of work. So if we kind of do a gender mapping, then if the men are doing one single day of labor, women are doing double day, or in a day is doing double shift. Though mothers have made many inroads into the first shift of paid labor, they are stuck with the second shift. The legitimization of the multitasking women, who is also rational in terms of earning, as well as a mother who is emotional, a caregiver, caretaker. So both the role model personality has been fitted into a single body. And as a result, women do not question. They are kind of stuck with the second shift of housework and child care. According to the author, due to economic changes, women started working outside. And this was because if we see the increased inflation, the rise in the wage, less employment, the increase in the living income or the requirement of the family, it was not possible for a single parent to earn. And therefore, a number of parents, double parents, started earning. So it was an economic need, plus supported by the women's movement for larger participation of women outside their house. However, there was no change in the attitude of men towards the work done in the domestic sphere. It was rather classified as a feminine task. It was kind of considered to be a task that was primarily to be done by women, and if the husband or the men were doing, then they were possibly providing a help or assistance. So the initial or the primary task was for the women. So in a kind of a general understanding, the men were considered as breadwinner, women were considered as caregiver, and the domestic realm belonged to her. It was her domain, and she was the kind of specialized in doing this kind of skilled task, which men were not. They were not capable of doing, and it was kind of considered as feminine, or it was considered as more a female work. The influx of women into the workforce sparked a sociological revolution in America, one that redefined the gender dynamics and blurred the concept of gender equality. Hochschild concluded from her research that despite the fact that they had professional career, the women did most, if not all, of the domestic work. And this we will see in the course of the discussion. This is more a problem of the middle class working women, because the upper class could afford for a maid or kind of a technology to kind of provide help, but The middle class are the women who were kind of doubly burdened, or the majority of the double shift or the second shift were done by working women belonging to the middle class. This included household work, childcare. She also concluded that while the men supported the women in their career, they failed to acknowledge the idea that the men should do half of the domestic work. And therefore, when she's trying to understand the gendered response to the increased participation of women, she's using a term called stalled revolution. And the stalled revolution implies that though the movement, that is the women's movement, was successful in helping women break into the formerly male-dominated market of paid labor, there was no corresponding movement of men into the female-dominated, non-market, unpaid labor, which was largely performed within the domestic sphere. So, if we can see, there is a stalled revolution. Why? At one point the change is taking place, whereas the other, it is static. It remains as it is. So, the change is visible in the productive sphere. We see that the gender equation is changing, say in the factory or in the production unit, and we see females doing productive work. However, when we go back to the reproductive or the domestic sphere, the story remains as it was before the movement, and that is why she is using the term stalled revolution. She is referring to the period where women are now working outside but continue to work in the home as well, and men have yet to realize and adapt to the changes in the domestic sphere. The tension caused by the stall revolution is that many men and women, to avoid becoming part of the two-job couple. The two-job marriage couple is basically where both the parents or both the conjugal partners are working. Now, the tension or the conflict or the increase in marital dispute, increase in the divorce rate in the 70s and 80s in America was a kind of a backlash to the women's movement, where a number of women, in order to safeguard the family, in order to retain the feminine task of childcare and taking care of the domestic sphere, they moved out of the work factories and productive work. As a result, we see withdrawal of women from the labor market, because it is again kind of considered that the onus of maintaining a marital relation or maintaining a family unit was on the women. Married couple clung to the tradition of man as provider and women as homemaker. So it was kind of going back to the main earlier acceptance of the gender division of labor as men doing public work and women doing the domestic work. Barbara Enright kind of gives us the concept of male revolt against the financial and emotional burden of supporting and raising a family. So the problem is also then that if only men are working, they are kind of under too much of financial pressure, and therefore there is a possibility of kind of revolting against why should only men earn. On the other hand, we have Sherhite, who's kind of giving the concept of female revolt in terms of why should women continue to do the invisible, unpaid, unrecognized work. So there is a kind of tension or contestation by both men and women. And the two-job couple are struggling to reconcile the demand of job and a happy family life. So it was kind of the work and the family were kind of contesting with each other. Let us look into some of the main themes in the work, The Second Shift. The first theme that Hochschild kind of gives attention to is work-life balance. Now, this work-life balance becomes significant as each couple is trying to balance two careers with the demands of the family. Now, why is he using two careers is in the sense that even though what you're doing within the domestic sphere is kind of considered as an important dimension of growth and progress, often the distribution is not equal. Studies and data shows that it is completely unequal. One thing that Hochschild found is that economic status of the family affected how they felt about the work-life balance, and this is again a class dimension. The work-life dimension would be kind of completely balanced in the upper class and also in the lower class, because in the lower class women have always been working. It is only the middle level where the work-life balance kind of gets disturbed. Families with higher economic status tended to want a more traditional work-life split, with the women doing most of the work at home while the man earned the money. The second theme in the book is marital relationship. The distribution of work greatly affects how marriages function. So marriage is not to be kind of considered something as an individual behavior or individual adaptation. It is equally connected to how the public sphere is working. So people get resentful towards their spouses when they have to ask them to take on work at home, and there is kind of a lot of anger, there is a lot of outburst of kind of frustrations which one experience either in the office or in the home, and this leads to kind of conflict between the conjugal partners, and therefore the marital relationship is affected. The resentment can be shown in the level of the tone. You kind of always starts using higher pitched or kind of more rude language in order to justify your side. The quality of marital relationship can improve or decline depending on how each partner feels about the balance of work at home. The third theme in the work, The Second Shift by Hochschild, is gender inequality. Often women get the majority of the work that happens at home, even if both parents are working equal hours. Even if they are working at the equal level or the nature of work is equal. So even then, the onus to ensure that the family or the domestic sphere is working is on the women. Since women have more contact with children, the children are more likely to want their mothers rather than their fathers. This leads to women doing more of the work. And also, if we look into the theory of gender socialization, women are kind of considered to be playing a dominant role in the socialization of the children. And this, the career graph plus the time when the children are growing almost runs parallelly. And this is where the women has to struggle to balance the career and her home. One thing that Hochschild found while doing research was that women tended to move about the house more in the evening, while men did less movement and stayed in one location. So even if we kind of look about the idea of mobility, so it is kind of problematic. Why? Because the women's movement was kind of talking about the mobility of women, that they should be allowed to be mobile, to move out of the domestic sphere to work. When they were granted this becomes a problem, because most of the time they are moving from the domestic work to the office. So they're literally traveling in a large part of the day or the month. Gender ideology is what a person believes about is proper for a given gender to do, say, or act. And here when we look into gender ideology, she is classifying it into three types: the traditional, egalitarian, and transitional. The traditional ideology is the belief in traditional gender role. And what is a traditional gender role? This is a simple division of work between men and women. Women doing much of the domestic sphere, taking care of the children, the reproductive, the cooking, the cleaning, and the men are supposed to be the breadwinner, and therefore they are working outside. The second gender ideology is egalitarian. The belief that both men and women's career are ambitious and they are both equally important and deserves equal support by men sharing in unpaid domestic and child care work. The third gender ideology is transitional, a blend of above two, typically manifested in women as the desire to have a greater career while also being responsible for home and family, and in men as being all for their wives, working and willing to help out a little, but she remains in charge of home and family. So transition is basically shifting from the traditional and egalitarian to allow space for both. The transitional women falls in between, blending the traditional and egalitarian ideology. It is not at all uncommon for the top and bottom gender ideologies of a person to be in direct conflict. But the question is, why should women do second shift? And Hochschild argues that we cannot have an explanation to it in psychology or economy, but what we need to look is into the mindset. And she suggests a meta theory capable of reflecting the complex interaction of the individual influences like childhood experience, adolescent experience, work experience, marital life experiences, and cultural experience. All of these 5 influences will kind of change the way both men and women look towards gender ideology. And this is why the idea of doing second shift becomes problematic. With this, I come to an end of this lecture. Thank you.